Hello! We are today going to talk about two women of real power. Elizabeth I of England and Catherine II of Russia. I guess that most of you have read about these two women in school, but just to be sure, I will give you a brief story of their lives. Elizabeth lived in the 1500s. She was the daughter of Henry VIII, you know, the one with all the wives, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. To be able to marry Anne, Henry had broken with the Catholic Church and made himself head of what was to become Church of England. Elizabeth was the third in the succession to the throne. Her siblings, Edward and Mary, both sat on the throne before her. Both of them for quite short times though, since both of them died of diseases. So Elizabeth became the Queen of England and Ireland. She never got married, even though everyone said and thought that she had to secure the succession. She reigned for 44 years and died in 1603. Catherine lived in the 1700s. She was a German princess that was chosen by the Russian Empress to be the consul of her nephew, who was later to become Peter III. They married when she was only 15 and he was 17. It was a disastrous marriage, and it took years before the marriage was consummated. Not until 9 years later did she give birth to her first child. I say her child because it has never been cleared whether it was Peter or her lover Saltykov who was the father of this child. Peter, who was also a German, never stopped being a German. Sophie, on the other hand, embraced all that was Russia. She changed her name to Yekaterina Alexeyevna. That's Catherine in English. She converted to the Orthodox Church and showed much respect for the Russian culture. The coup d'etat that placed her on the throne was driven by the Russian military. They had no respect whatsoever for Peter. And the fact that one of the officers was Catherine's lover probably helped a bit too. Catherine reigned for 34 years and she died in 1796. These are both two awesome queens. But who was the most awesome? And which one of them had the greater impact on the history to come after them? Let's set a scoreboard. Elizabeth and Catherine. I just want to remind you now that these scores are totally subjective. These are my opinions. My first question is about the struggle to the throne. And I must give Catherine this one. Even though Elizabeth was wise and kept herself still and waited for her time to come, Catherine worked really hard from a very early age to be a woman that the Russian people could love and respect. One to Catherine. What about their foreign policies? Elizabeth focused mostly on defending the country and avoiding conflicts. She did engage in some disastrous war campaigns, but they were very few. Her refusal to accept marriage proposals and that she had them think that she was actually contemplating it was also a clever way to make other countries unwilling to declare war on England. Catherine's Russia is constantly at war. They are mostly doing quite well, and above all, they are the only ones to actually defeat the Ottoman Empire. War, though, is expensive and takes a great toll on the people. So, even if empire building is often seen as extra powerful, my opinion is that peace is better than war. So, the point for foreign policy goes to Elizabeth. Question number 3, the suffering of the people. In this category, the contestants compete about not losing a point. In Elizabeth's 44 years as a ruler, the English population grew from 3 million to 4 million inhabitants. And most of those were, of course, in the lower classes. And their poverty increases even more when the government works really hard to avoid economic inflation. Changes in laws on agriculture also had people leaving the rural areas for the cities. In this time in Elizabethan England, they started to work on new poverty laws. These laws are not anything we would accept today, but for its time it was quite progressive. But the worst failed in this matter in Elizabeth's reign. She was the Queen of Ireland, but she treated the Irish really, really bad. Rebellion uprisings were met with the slaughter of both men and women and children, and thousands of the Irish starved to death. The lowest classes of Catherine's Russia were the serfs and peasants. They were kind of like slaves, but they were bound to the land they worked on. The serfs were privately owned and the peasants were owned by the state, so they came with the land. They did have a bit more rights than our usual view of a slave's life. Catherine saw a problem with all the serfs in Russia and actually gave them a bit more rights than they had had earlier. But at the same time she took away their right to complain directly to her. And even though she tried to decrease the number of serfs in Russia by changing the rules on how to become a serf, she did give away a lot of the state-owned land to the nobility, and with that a lot of the peasants now became serfs instead. So, who loses the point? Even though Elizabeth's treatment of Ireland was really, really bad, there's no comparison to actually owning another human being. So Catherine clearly loses this one. What about doing beneficiary things for common people then? Well, it's not that easy to find what Elizabeth did for the common people, except from legislating a lot on what they were allowed to eat and wear. Her father had made a bunch of laws on physicians and their education, but this was nothing that benefited common people. No regular person could afford to visit a physician. They themselves had to know something about herbs and methods of healing if someone got ill, and what I can find, Elizabeth seems to have done nothing about this. There were schools in Elizabethan England, but of course only for the boys. Probably there were quite a lot of boys that never attended at all. Catherine lived in the era of Enlightenment, and she took great impression from the philosophers of the time, like Voltaire and Diderot. She was also keen on implicating new sciences. For instance, she and her children were the first ones in Russia to be vaccinated, or inoculated as the proper term is, and that was 30 years before the man usually credited for the vaccine started his experiments. She founded hospitals for civilians all over Russia, and in doing so she saved thousands of lives. Catherine also believed that Russia would benefit from having a better educated population, and started schools for all, well, except from serfs and peasants, of course. But even girls were allowed to attend these schools. Catherine definitely wins this category. Both queens lived in eras of flourishing arts. England had really good both music composers and painters, but it is for the theatre that we best know the Elizabethans. Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and above all William Shakespeare. But how remarkably fond of the arts Elizabethan England was Elizabeth herself never seemed to have been bothered with it. The English Renaissance happened on its own, and the greatest impact that Elizabeth had on it was that England under her had an air of stability and security in which these arts could flourish. Catherine, on the other hand, was a truly devoted patron of the arts. She bought huge amounts of art, and her private collections was eventually the foundations of art museums. She founded, among other things, the Bolshoi Theatre. She wrote books, she composed operas, and she inspired the Russian Enlightenment, something that was to lay the groundwork for Russia's magnificent literary culture in the 1800s. 1 point for Catherine. Which one of these ladies had the largest impact on history then? I have to give this one to Elizabeth. Even though Catherine had a huge impact on what was to become the Russian cultural society, the Enlightenment was something in fashion. She wasn't the only regent to do this. Elizabeth, on her side, founded the Church of England. Well, her father started it, but she shaped it, and that is still in work today. The Poor Laws that I spoke of earlier was in use as long as until 1834. And in her time, the English colonization of North America started. Well, we could end it here, with those queens equally awesome. But there is one question that remains, and that is the question of womanhood. This is a women's history channel after all. Did they rule as women, or did they try to be as manly as they could? Did they allow themselves to be women? Well, even though there are talks about Elizabeth's ongoing romance with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, there are no stories of any other lovers or any sexual life at all. She also almost apologized for being just a woman, even though she claimed to have the heart of a man. No, Elizabeth, that is not how to do it. Catherine did live in a different time, but even in her time, women were not supposed to behave the way she did. She needed to get married to get to the throne, but even as a married woman, she had several lovers. And as a widow and a queen, there were even more of them. And the older she became, the younger the lovers got. It is possible that she married the love of her life, Potemkin, but they never made it official. If they had done so, she probably would have lost the throne, as had Elizabeth, had she gotten married. Clearly, Catherine was better at using her strengths as a woman, and that is why Catherine II of Russia, Catherine the Great, is the most awesome queen. I hope you learned something new today. See you soon, I hope. Bye.